I'm going to talk about historic districts today, as Sherry said. I want to say that this is very much co-authored work, although I want to be clear that Vicki Bean worked on this project before she was appointed Commissioner of New York City, so our conclusions reflect neither the views of HBD nor the views of the Federal Reserve, where another co-author, Wagner alum Mike Gould, now work. So get those disclaimers out of the way. Preservation advocates and their critics have been debating the merits of preservation for decades, and nowhere has that debate been more fierce than in New York City, where the preservation community was really galvanized by the demolition of much beloved Penn Station, and which led to the creation of the Landmark Preservation Commission in 1965, and some 50 years later, we have about 113 historic districts in New York City. And I'm going to talk about one, our research really is focused mostly on one aspect of that debate, which is whether the designation of historic districts, how that designation affects property values. And in particular, whether the designation of historic districts increases or decreases the value of properties within districts, and how the designation affects the value of properties immediately surrounding historic districts. I'm not going to give a full-blown exposition of our theory, but the answer is that it depends, and the basic intuition is that historic preservation brings both benefits and costs. So the good news is that you can be assured that the historic character of your neighborhood will be preserved. And the bad news, of course, is that as an owner, the designation restricts your ability to redevelop your property. So for example, if you live on this lovely West Village street, you can be assured that the presence of the Greenwich Village Historic District means that your neighbors across the street can't tear down their buildings and build this in their place. Okay, for those of you that don't recognize this building, this is actually the HUD building in New York, in Washington, where Kathy O'Regan now works. And this is a building that HUD Secretary Sean Donovan, an architect himself, affectionately calls 10 floors of basement. But of course, on the other hand, right, so the good news is that you can be sure that your neighbors across the street won't tear down their homes. The bad news is, of course, that at the same time, you can't tear down your home either and rebuild. And so on net, then, this combination of benefits and costs leads us to predict that sort of unambiguously, we think that the designation of historic districts should increase the value of the properties immediately surrounding districts, right? Because those properties get the best of both worlds in some sense, right? On the one hand, they get the benefits of this being near adjacent to this beautiful historic district. On the other hand, they don't face any of the restrictions on altering their property, right? Now, when we think about what happens to property values, the values of properties within districts, the story's a little bit more complicated, right? And what we predict is basically that designation should boost property values in neighborhoods where the amenity value is very high, and at the same time, the value of the option to redevelop those properties is relatively low. Okay, so owners are giving up less. That's where property values will increase. And let me just give you another example. So in historic districts and sort of single-family home neighborhoods like this Harrison Street in Staten Island, we would expect that historic designation here should increase property values, because it turns out in this neighborhood in Staten Island, you couldn't, even without the historic district, you actually wouldn't be allowed to build a tall building in this neighborhood. And even if you were allowed to, it wouldn't be nearly as valuable as a tall building in Manhattan. And so owners of properties in districts like Harrison Street are not giving up as much as owners in Greenwich Village, right, who are losing a lot by the restriction on their ability to tear down their home and build a tall building like the ones in a very valuable building like the ones in the background of this photograph. So how do we test this? In brief, I'm not going to get through all the statistical bells and whistles, but in brief, basically what do? We compare the value of homes that are inside historic districts, right, to the value of homes that are just outside districts and their buffer, but still in the same neighborhood. And then we compare how that differential changes after the designation of the district. This is just called a difference in difference method, okay? And what do we find? We basically find, as predicted, that the value of properties in the buffer zone immediately surrounding districts do increase with time after designation, just as we predict. Again, these are the properties that sort of get the benefit of both worlds. Secondly, we also find that on average, citywide, that property values in districts increase after designation. Again, this is on average citywide. Okay, but then when we look at Manhattan, we see a very different story. In Manhattan, and this again, this is as predicted by the theory, property values actually fall after designation. Okay, now I want to be clear that this is not always statistically significant, but again, this is consistent with their theory because in Manhattan, property owners, the lost value, the lost option to redevelop your property in Manhattan is very, very high. It's much higher than in other boroughs of the city. And so property owners in historic districts in Manhattan are giving up a lot when their area gets districted. Okay? So I want to be clear that this research doesn't end debates about preservations, to be sure. We're not considering the impact of the benefits of that architectural preservation to city residents more generally outside of the neighborhood, to people outside of New York altogether. We're also not considering the potential costs of the increase in housing prices that results from the restriction in supply. But we do hope that these findings do help to add some nuance to the debate and ultimately help to inform the difficult choices that decision makers have to make. So thank you.